Appelez-vous, monsieur. That means go, baby.
My grandfather, Dr. Jerome Hurd, was born on Halloween 1925 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He has lived and continues to live one of the most fulfilling lives one can live and hope for. He's not an average person, but part of the greatest generation. His childhood was consumed by the Great Depression, which continued until the end of the Second World War in 1945. During this time period, his dad always had a job as a shipping clerk, which kept them under a roof. Dr. Hurd recalls the newly impoverished people coming to the front door of his house, greeted by his mother, and steered towards the kitchen, where the cook would prepare them a hot meal. Dr. Hurd enjoyed talking to these men and women who came and ate in his kitchen. On July 1st, 1943, at age 17, following his first year of pre-med, he enrolled in Tulane University's V12 program. The V12 program was an accelerated program which allowed him to become a doctor in 3 years at the age of 22. Tulane had only one dorm room for athletics, so they crammed 900 aspiring doctors into the gymnasium. As a young doctor, he worked on orthopedic wards, seeing many war injuries. Following World War II, in 1948, he was sent to the Navy Hospital in San Diego, but his training was interrupted when the Korean War started in 1950. In 1952, he was restationed in Yokosuka, Japan, taking a 35-hour plane trip from San Diego to get there. The base commander, Captain Starr, appointed him port surgeon, which made him responsible for the following: 1. Insect and rodent control officer, 2. The emergency room, 3. The medical officer to the chief of staff, 4. VD control officer, 5. Screening Japanese civilians working on the base, 6. In charge of air evacuations, making him in charge of triaging Marines and soldiers coming from Korea 50 at a time. One day, while still in the Navy in Japan, he found out that 3 Marines were in jail for purchasing heroin, so he and his friend Steve decided that they would defend them in court even though they had no previous law experience. However, he read the procedural book and took the case to a special court-martial. A Japanese civilian testified against the 3 Marines. Dr. Jerome Hurd objected and noted that he was under the influence of marijuana. An ER doctor was able to verify this and this prevented the evidence from being used. He also acted as a legal counsel in a legal case and defended a corpsman for drunk driving while coming back to base. The prosecutor didn't want the doctor in Yokosuka to have to drive to the base, so both he and my grandfather went to the doctor and took a deposition. However, Dr. Hurd noticed that the deposition wasn't taken under oath, but didn't object until the court hearing. Again, this evidence couldn't be used. The doctor had to come to court to testify, saying he smelled alcohol on the corpsman. Dr. Hurd had him read the definition of alcohol being a colorless and odorless liquid, so they couldn't prove that he had been drinking. Also while in Japan, his wife, Ensign Hurd, wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt about the difficulties of being a Navy wife, as Mrs. Roosevelt was very interested in the lives and families of the servicemen. Mrs. Roosevelt in fact read this letter and invited Ensign Hurd to tea at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, to which she happily obliged. Following the Korean War in 1954, he was discharged from the Navy and went to New Orleans to finish his medical training as a pathologist. Following the completion of his training, he and Mrs. Hurd moved to San Diego to raise their family. In the early 1960s, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his 3 kids, one of which my mom, had monthly air raid drills where they would duck under their desks when they heard the alarm go off. The following year, in 1963, he was part of the national experience of the shock and mourning of the assassination of our President Kennedy. On his son's 11th birthday, May 5, 1961, he awakened the whole family to watch Alan Shepard become the first American man to enter space. In the next several years, Dr. Hurd and his family witnessed the following Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions, from takeoff to landing. Some years later, he was the chairman to elect Ronald Reagan governor of California, which was highlighted in 1966 and Reagan visited the campaign headquarters, meeting the entire Hurd family as seen with my mom on the right. Since that time, my grandfather has done much more. In the following decades, my grandfather retired in 1983 to his colleagues' sadness and traveled much of the world. He and my grandmother traveled to every continent except Australia. They have ridden elephants on their 4 trips to India, visited China on multiple occasions, seen Antarctica, and thoroughly traversed Europe, and was able to see the Oberammergau in Germany. In addition, they met the Dalai Lama in the 1990s. In the weeks that follow, my grandparents, Dr. Hurd and Mrs. Hurd, will be celebrating their 65th wedding anniversary. They met in 1948 and have lived happily married ever since. My grandmother is also an extraordinary person who served as an officer and nurse in the Navy and who also enjoys shooting Thompson submachine guns. She remembers the 1932 Long Beach earthquake, as did her father, Lieutenant Commander Burnson, who was aboard his naval ship, the Argonne, conducting soundings in the Aleutian Islands. He wrote down this event in his journal and worried about the fate of his family. Luckily, the Burnsons were all right, allowing my grandmother to marry my grandfather, thus creating our great family.